Hey folks, so I was scrolling through Twitter just now, and I noticed that one of the trending topics was Bruce Wayne. And this is Monday that I'm recording this, so it's one of the trending topics today. You're not going to see this until Wednesday, so bear that in mind. There were a bunch of people that were replying to and quote tweeting this tweet that I had quote tweeted the other day as well, by a Twitter user named Gus Lives Again. And it just says, say controversial Batman takes. And apparently a lot of the controversial Batman takes that people were sharing had to do with Bruce Wayne. And one of my controversial Batman takes that I shared when I quote tweeted that tweet was a Bruce Wayne related thing. And that was that I don't think that Bruce should be a billionaire. And there are a lot of different reasons why I feel that way, but I do strongly feel that Bruce Wayne should not be a billionaire. Now, I think he should be rich, but the reason I think he should be rich mostly has to do with plot-related stuff. I think Bruce should be as rich as he needs to be in order to explain how he can afford to be Batman. And I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that one of the reasons why Bruce Wayne was created to be a rich guy in the first place, back in the late 30s when Bob Kane and also Bill Finger and a little bit later Jerry Robinson, and when all of these great, really talented artists and writers, and also Bob Kane, were creating Batman initially, they made him rich, I suspect, just as a plot convenience to explain, well, how can this guy afford to do all these things that he does? Where does he get the equipment? Where does he get the car and the plane and all the stuff that Batman didn't have initially, but pretty soon the gadgets and the vehicles and became a pretty big part of Batman and who he was and what he did. And the easy way to explain that is to say, oh, well, he's rich. You know, he's rich. And they had done that. That was sort of a common trope among pulp heroes at the time. Lamont Cranston, the Shadow, was also of a similar type, and the Shadow was a big influence on Batman. So it just makes certain things easier. You can just sort of wave things off and say, well, he can afford it because he's rich, and that's how he's able to be Batman. And because of that, I think it makes sense to have Bruce be as rich as he needs to be in order to explain him being Batman, being able to afford to be Batman, but not a whole lot richer than that. I think that Bruce should be famous in Gotham City and one of the wealthier people in Gotham City, but not terribly well known or famous outside of that part of the country. I think he should be sort of rich for his area. He should be kind of a regional celebrity. Wayne Enterprises or Wayne Tech, whatever you want to call it, should be more of a regional company. It should not be this vast global conglomerate. I think that the more modern DC Comics, and when I say modern, I mean like, you know, in the last 30 years or so, have really leaned into making Bruce the good guy equivalent, or to use wrestling parlance, which I am wont to do, the babyface equivalent of Lex Luthor. So the DC universe is sort of ruled by these twin titans of industry. There's a good guy billionaire, Bruce Wayne, and there's the evil billionaire, Lex Luthor. And even though they're involved in different families of characters, because Batman is over here doing Batman stuff most of the time, and Lex is over here doing Superman stuff most of the time, every once in a while, if they have a big crossover, or if they need to sort of cross-pollinate a little bit, you'll see Lex and Bruce kind of butting heads, and Bruce is the good billionaire, and Lex is the evil billionaire. And, you know, there are problems with that I have on sort of a moral level. I'm not sure if I'm totally comfortable depicting someone who is supposedly that rich as being a hero. If you're going to take a character and have him be that rich, have him be not just a pretty rich guy for the city that he's in, but have him be a billionaire who is one of the most influential and powerful people on the planet, which is kind of the direction that they've gone with Bruce. They've made him into the babyface Lex Luthor. If you're going to say that Bruce is that rich and that prominent and that powerful, and he's not actively spending a massive amount of that fortune to lift people in Gotham out of poverty and to address those systemic problems that are dragging that city down and leading it to become such a place of poverty and decay, if Bruce is not making that a focal point of his life, then he's kind of a villain, isn't he? If he's only using his billions to finance being Batman and, maybe some token charity stuff here and there, and other than that, it's just running his company, in what sense is he a hero? If you want to keep telling Batman stories and sort of reduce that problem with the character of, well, he's a billionaire, he should be using his money to address these problems on the large scale instead of going out every night as a vigilante and beating up street thugs and occasionally thwarting a supervillain and thinking that that's going to make a difference. Instead of doing that, he should be using his money to make a difference. If we just give him a lot less money, then that becomes less of an issue. I still think if Bruce is a rich guy, he should be using his money to help people in non-Batman related ways. I still think you have that part of the character that needs to be there and needs to be addressed. But if he's not internationally famous as a billionaire, if he's not like Jeff Bezos rich, then you don't have the Jeff Bezos problems as much as you would if he were. I mean, I think about this a lot. There was an interview I saw with Jeff Bezos, I think a couple years ago, and they were asking him about his spaceflight company that he started, Blue Origin. The interviewer asked him, why are you starting a spaceflight company? And Jeff Bezos said, well, it's the only project big enough. Going to space, sending people to space is the only project big enough for all the money I have. Those weren't his exact words, but that's basically what he was saying. He's so rich that the only project big enough for all his money is creating a spaceflight company. And immediately I'm sitting there watching it going, so what, hungry people don't exist? Homeless people don't exist? Everybody's got health care, everybody's got food and shelter, everybody's got what they need. There's no problem in society that your money that you apparently have so much of, you don't know what to spend it on. There's no, education, nothing. There's no problem in our society that the enormous pile of money you're sitting on could do anything to help. So you're just sort of thinking, well, I guess I'll just send people to space. What else am I going to do with it? It would be the same problem in the fictional world of DC Comics with Bruce Wayne. If he was that rich and we didn't see him spending his billions of dollars to lift people out of poverty and lift Gotham out of decay, then it's really difficult to call him a good guy. Just like it's pretty much impossible to call Jeff Bezos a good guy when he's, and leave all the Amazon stuff aside, all the mistreatment of workers and the anti-unionization and all that stuff. Just Jeff Bezos as an individual with the massive fortune that he has accumulated from Amazon and said exploitation of workers, etc., etc. Leave all that aside and just look at this guy with this enormous fortune. It's pretty much impossible to consider him a good guy if he's not actively spending a ton of that money to make the world a better place and to help those in need. So if you make Bruce that rich, he's kind of got to do that if you want him to be a good guy. So if you make him less rich, it's less of a problem. And it kind of goes hand in hand with something that I talk about fairly frequently when I talk about not just comic book characters, but Star Trek and pretty much any fictional world that has a lot of lore or has a lot of backstory or has a lot of world building, which is, I think, as a member of the audience, as a critic, as a writer, if I'm going to write like fanfic about it or something, it's really important for me to separate what is backstory, what is just there for plot convenience, and what I think is actually really important to who this character is and what this story that I'm either watching or trying to create is about. To me, Bruce being rich is backstory. Bruce being rich is there to explain why he can be Batman. Just as, and I've used this example a ton of times too, why is Superman from another planet? Why does Krypton even exist? What is the narrative function of Krypton in the Superman story? It's to explain why he has superpowers. Why can this guy fly? Why is this guy so strong and so fast? Where does he get these powers? Oh, he's from this other planet. That's why Krypton exists. It explains Superman's powers. That's why Bruce Wayne is rich. It explains how he is able to be Batman. It takes care of it. It takes it off the table, so it's not a distraction anymore. It's not something we need to worry about. It's been explained. There, put it up on the shelf. Don't worry about it unless you come up with a particular story that makes use of it. Then you take it down from the shelf and you say, let's examine it. But if you don't have that story, you're not trying to tell that story, you just want to show us Batman being Batman, then okay, we just take it for granted. He's rich. He can afford this stuff. I was talking about this on Twitter with some folks, and Dragon Cobalt, who is an author and has been one of my viewers and patrons for a while, he chimed in and said, well, one of the things that, in terms of narrative convenience, that actually works better if Bruce is a massive multi-billionaire is that you can explain how the Justice League is able to do stuff by saying, oh, Bruce paid for it. So if Bruce is that rich in that sense, it can help with plot stuff because you can just write stuff off to Bruce. How can the Justice League afford to have an orbital headquarters? Oh, Bruce paid for that. That's Wayne Tech money, right? And I see that point. But my rebuttal to that, in continuing to argue that I prefer Bruce not being that rich, is to say that I don't care how the Justice League paid for the Watchtower. Those are the kinds of details that I'm perfectly happy just sort of waving off. You just sort of take it for granted. That's what suspension of disbelief is for. And if you can come up with a really clever story about it, or you can come up with a really fun way to acknowledge it or to explore it or to explain it, that's great. But just my personal opinion as an audience member, as a reader or a viewer or whatever, and as a storyteller, if I'm writing fanfic about it, I'm not that interested. I'll take all that for granted. I'll start from that point. They're the Justice League. They have an orbital headquarters. It's just there. It came from someplace that isn't important to explain for the purposes of this story. Let's just talk about what we're here to talk about. Let's just get on with the story that we're trying to tell here. I'm completely fine with that. I don't need anything explained. And if the story does take the time to explain it just for the sake of explaining it, that'll probably get on my nerves. I'll probably think, why are we wasting time with this when we could be just diving into what the story is really about? So those are just some thoughts that I had about seeing Bruce Wayne trend on Twitter, and that idea that I sort of contributed to when I quote tweeted that tweet about Bruce being rich but not that rich. I think it's important to draw a line between what is important for the story and what is there for the purposes of backstory and explanation that we don't really need to dwell on. And to me, usually Bruce being rich is the sort of thing that just needs to be there to explain why he's Batman. And if we make him rich enough just to explain that, and we don't make him into the heroic, opposite of Lex Luthor, then not only does it fulfill its plot necessity, which to me is the main reason why it's there in the first place, but you at least reduce a lot of the billionaire-related problems with Bruce and a lot of the sort of moral implications that you get into with is it right for this guy to be a hero when his heroic acts involve him spending his money on himself so he can go beat up bad guys on the street and not really make much of a difference in the big picture, when he could be using all those billions and billions and billions of dollars to actually make a difference in his city. If you don't give him billions and billions and billions of dollars, you can kind of skip that. And at least it's not as much of a problem. He still has resources. He still has a lot of money. He doesn't spend all of it on being Batman, and he should still be using it to improve conditions for people in the city. But it's not as much of a moral responsibility on him when you're not saying that he has so much money that he could afford to completely fund all the public schools out of his own pocket for years and years to come, or he could provide, free health care for however many millions of people in the city for however long of a time or whatever. If he doesn't have that kind of money, then you don't have to reckon with those kinds of moral quandaries in the story, and you can just focus on telling fun Batman stories, if that's what you want to do. Now, if you want to explore the moral implications of Bruce being a billionaire and you want to tell Batman stories that are about that and about that conflict and him trying to find that balance between being Batman and being a responsible rich person, that's great if that's the story you want to tell. But I think the problem that a lot of people have with billionaire superheroes these days, as we're sort of more aware of the issues, the ethical issues of, should anybody even be a billionaire? Shouldn't society be reclaiming a lot of that money and redistributing it to serve the needs of society? Why should we allow people like Jeff Bezos in real life, or like Lex Luthor or Bruce Wayne in comic books? Why should we allow people like this to hoard this much wealth when society as a whole could be benefiting from it? If you want to tell stories like that with Batman, that's fantastic. I would love to read those. But if you don't want to deal with that, a really good way to handle it is to just make Bruce not as rich. Because there's no narrative necessity for him to be that rich. There's no narrative necessity for Bruce to be as rich as Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor being that rich makes sense because Lex is a villain. That's natural. For Lex to be a multi-billionaire and to be an evil guy, that fits like a glove. But for Bruce to be a good guy and be a multi-billionaire and his heroic activities consist of him being Batman for the most part, that's when you run into problems. So if you want to tell stories about that and examine those issues and examine those complexities, fantastic. But if you're interested in Batman stories where he's mostly just being Batman, running around doing Batman stuff, better to skip the multi-billionaire thing. Just make him a millionaire. Make him millionaire playboy Bruce Wayne. There's not a problem with that at all. He got along just fine as a millionaire for decades and decades and decades. He doesn't need to be a billionaire unless, you want him to. I think that's it.